welcome back to the channel, and with 2K23 coming, we think, to the end of its game cycle, I thought it would be a nice time to review my own courses from this cycle. There have been 12 of them in total, it's been pretty productive, and so I wanted to rank my own personal favourites of where I would put them and things that I particularly like about each of them. I don't feature my own courses on the channel maybe as much as some others, so it might be nice for those of you who don't know all of my work to see some of it and what I think of each of them. So we're going to go from 12th all the way up to 1st in terms of personal preference purely, and kind of giving you some insights into those courses. Enjoy. Okay, and coming in at 12th will be Lan Crossing. Now this one comes with a big caveat. It was made at the start of 23 before, in fact, we had even a beta, so it was very, very rough. We got given 3 weeks to make the courses from scratch using a designer that was phenomenally buggy. So given that, I think I did a pretty good job, and there's lots of it that I really like. However, ultimately it's at the bottom because it was just too severe for what I wanted, and we didn't know when we were getting that version of the designer that the game was going to play tougher. So there's a lot of things that I would have softened. However, certainly still some things that I like. I think the routing holds up and is interesting. I think the off-course area, particularly the town, is probably some of the best I've done. And there's interest to quite a lot of the holes, but it's not remotely close to any of my favourites for those reasons, really. It's one where I learned a lot through doing this and would definitely do it differently had I had my time again. First hole obviously borrows heavily from the old course, albeit with one central bunker because we're more accurate than any pros on this game. Now, this one therefore allowed you to choose where you were going to lay up to in order to attack this green, with certain pins dictating slightly better angles from different spots. It was one that I felt set the tone nicely, plus it gave you a sight of that village town thing over on the left of the way. When designing these courses, we only had a default dude to playtest with, and in fact the playtest feature for us was disabled for 2 of the 3 weeks of construction, so it became pretty difficult to make these. That said, I'm really happy with how the 4th has turned out. Now these 2 cross bunkers were only ever meant for the longest hitters. We were guessing as to where they would land, and they come into play pretty nicely. But the green itself, there's lots of fairway around it, which ultimately has aged pretty well. And therefore, as a kind of punch bowl, it accepted a lot of different shots. There were some interesting pockets and rolls within this green. And yeah, I think for my money, probably the hole that on this course has lasted the best. And while there are several holes that I would have redone, one of the ones I was most happy with was the 13th, which was modelled after the 13th at St Andrews, the long. Now here you had a choice of a blind drive towards the out of bounds on the left, which gave you a preferable angle, or taking on those 2 little pots on the right or laying further back. If you laid further back, that brought in the Hell's bunker in the middle and loads of potential layup challenges. Now the green itself sat right next to the out of bounds, and we won't talk about how long the train tracks took, nor the train that I was told to dismantle, but led to a very undulating, challenging green. I think this hole has interesting strategic merit, and it was one which does still challenge players today. Coming in at 11, and you have Greenmont CC. Now, this one I think was pretty good and pushed me out my comfort zone with bunkering, but it's certainly not my favourite style, nor do I think I nailed it, which is kind of why it is where it is. Additionally, I was just trying to make a fun, simple parkland course, and whilst I think I succeeded, it's therefore probably not got as many of the bells and whistles as some of my other courses. I also learned how difficult it is to do some of these Ross shapes and greens and things, and that I have the utmost respect for people like Tanner who can pull those off really, really well. It's something I can do, but I don't think I can do it as well as maybe I would like to be able to. That said, there are certainly some parts of this that I really liked. I was given a plot with constraints in terms of the area and managed to route it pretty comfortably within that, making quite a good amount of the creek, as well as finding some, I think, quite interesting green sites. Planting, obviously, I started trying to do grasses and then found that that was just impossible with the meters. So hopefully, whenever we get a new game, that will become a little bit easier. But overall, it holds up pretty well. I think it hosted an event on CC and people didn't complain too much. But yeah, That's why it is where it is. However, favourite holes. I really like the third hole from the outset. So this one had the creek running through pretty much exactly like this, and it tightened the layup area, and there was obviously a green sitting right at the end of it. So it gives you a ton of choices to make, and then when making the green and having a couple of plateaus, found this made it more interesting in terms of where you play too. So my personal favourite of the par threes nestled in right behind the third, and it was fun to try to squeeze this one in just behind it. The seventh plays slightly downhill to a green that's at an angle with OB and kind of fences just behind it. It's not the most special of par threes, but I loved how this sat in the routing and just made everything work and got you from one side to the other. The back nine finished up higher on the property, up on the left hand side near this ridge, and 17 was always the best of the par fives for my money. You got these two bunkers cutting into a fairway, and then you got the good reveal of the town just down this side, which I always thought worked quite nicely. And the green tucked up against that. It wasn't the most difficult of par fives or challenging, but I loved the way this one sat. And the bunkering I thought really worked nicely, as well as traversing some interesting elevation. Landing at number 10, we have West Holm Ridge, also known as the one with all the rocks. This one started out as a 2K project that they wanted me to do, but I didn't have a ton of guidance, and they later changed their minds and decided they wanted to do it in house, which was absolutely fine by me. As a result, this one has probably more of a fantasy style because I was trying to guess as to what they might like than my other courses, and it's certainly on the extreme side with the elevation change, which is something I wanted to challenge myself with. I've always loved Cinderella's mountain courses, and so this is probably the closest you'll get to one of those from me. As a result, it's not so much one of my favourites. It's a bit too fantasy for my liking, even if I do like the setting and how it ultimately panned out. And there's certainly some holes that I will remember fondly from this project, and we're going to have a little dig into some of those. When I made this plot, hole 6 was one that was always just kind of there. There was this big dip, but I'm thrilled with how it laid out in the end. It's a hole that's a lot of fun. You can land the ball short, you can roll it towards the back. There's quite a lot of space, even though it's a pretty severe elevation drop. And it's one where it was just beautiful in terms of how it laid out as well. Certainly, I wish the game made it play a little bit longer than it does, but it's a ton of fun. While the cliffside holes will get all of the love on this course, a low key favourite of mine was the 11th, which turned around these bunkers on the inside. An honourable mention as well to the 17th. The tee shot was fine, but it was the approach shot that really made this one. This kind of uphill shot where you're hitting to a small, pretty narrow green, or rather shallow, and trying to hold it on there above this false front. I thought it was a really good testing par 5 approach, and I hit some really fun shots into this one whilst playtesting. My final hole choice on this one's probably an interesting one, as a lot of people who I spoke to whilst making it didn't really feel this one fitted. But for me, this was always the moment of kind of calm and a relatively flatter sight on the course. And I loved the way this just sat against the backdrop, and you just had this before you started trekking back uphill. The short par 4, potentially drivable for some, with water down the right. It's a simple hole, but for me, sometimes you need that little breather in the middle of the round. And I really liked the way this one did that, even if, and just shows there can be differences of opinion. The second of the official courses from before launch was Emory Beach, and that makes its way in at number. Now, this one suffers from the same issues as Lan Crossing. I still had the default dude to play test with, didn't have a lot of time, had a designer that was constantly crashing and buggy, and tried to do flat bottom bunkers in that designer, which was probably a poor choice. However, I still think this one really holds up, and actually, nearer the end of the game cycle, I think it works well as a decent test now people are dialed in. It was probably a bit too hard at launch, and certainly that's something I've learned from, as mentioned with Lachlan. But I really liked the aesthetic and environment. I thought it was simple and done pretty well, I think. And the routing was always a lot of fun with this one, how it pinwheeled back on itself. There's also some really strong holes that I thought still hold up now. I'm going to look at a few of those. With very little time to complete the course, it won't surprise many people that I went back to the template well. And so 8 is our Eden. It sits nicely. It's really well framed in its own little corner, and I thought it just had a really good spot. Also, still plays pretty well, and the green is fairly severe. It's not a novel hole, but I really like it. Aside from having to deal with the horrible lighting, 15 is probably my favourite of the par fours. It's a switchback, so not strictly a template, but you have to fade off the tee and then a draw into the green. And this one, loosely based on a hole at Pinehurst, I want to say the eighth, features a really cool green that feeds towards the right. So it really did make a difference as to how you approached the hole based on which side of the fairway you came from. And I think this one still holds up. I just liked its simplicity more than anything. 18 will not be the first nor the last core and Crenshaw template that you've seen from me, and it's such a good 18th hole. As you're putting trouble right away to one side, it's really risk reward. And this one had the slight spin of a semi island green. The layup shot became a little bit trickier depending on where you were laying and how far you went. But the amount of times I found the water right at the green in playtesting made this work really, really nicely. I still like the green as it is as well, and thought this was a fitting closer. Now, eighth place brings the most recent course of mine, and one that you can follow the entire design of over on YouTube, with Sutton Brook GC. Now, this one is just simple. There's nothing much to it, and for that, it was a really fun build. I didn't have to fight with it. I didn't worry about redoing holes very much. I just kind of made what I saw, and therefore kind of worked out really well. Additionally, it's on the easier side, which means it's more fun to play. Now, there are not as many frills on this as some of my other courses. I could have planted a lot more grass, for example, and really livened it up that way. But actually, there's a kind of beauty in the simplicity that this one has for me. And so that's why it ranks where it does. It's certainly not my best, but it is enjoyable, and I think there's strategic merit there for those who are looking for it. And we're going to dive into the three holes that I think have held up the best from this one. A low-key favourite of mine was always the fifth hole. Now, this one doesn't do very much. There's a couple of staggered bunkers, so depending on driver distance, which was a key thing for this one, given it was going on CC, you'd want to choose your line and length pretty carefully. There's then a split fairway, which just adds a little bit of interest, and then working towards a green with one bunker on the side, and an interesting green complex with a little pocket on the left. Again, just for me, this whole course was proof that you don't need to do anything that flashy and you can still create some really good, enjoyable golf. Similar in some ways to the hole we saw at West Holm Ridge, I really liked 15 that just works its way around this creek that was there from the outset, with a large tree making you think about it if you are going to drive the green. There were lots of layup opportunities, and you could choose to play this a number of different ways. I think the balance of going for it versus not was about right for this one. The green, again, doesn't do anything crazy, but that raised middle portion meant you had to be a little bit more precise, whilst giving you a couple of ways to get the ball to back or front pins. It's a fun hole, if not the most dramatic. Straight on the back of that, this middle section of the back nine was by far my favourite part of the course, and 16 was one which at the start didn't have a lot going for it. But with the elevation and just simply having a fairway that plunged down and then up and a green complex perched on top of the hill, it made some of my most interesting approaches. The green's quite a large one. It does a bit more than some of the others, but it gives you really good sights from all around the course. It was just a fun approach on a course where this sort of thing would be done. They haven't moved much, and it just creates interesting golf shots. And in at number 7 is Cranborne South. Now, this one, I think it's the sum of its parts are better than the individual holes necessarily. And you kind of have to view this one as combination with the North course that Petty did. Now, in terms of what drags this down a little, I think some of the technical work on the bunkers is different to how I've done it before and possibly better. Ultimately, you're dealing with lack of freshness. I've done a lot of sandbelt courses, and they're by far the thing I like to make the most. But maybe that puts it a little lower on my own personal rankings for that reason. Additionally, there's some holes that are perhaps a little bit video gamey. This one was for a duos contest, but I didn't give it as much time as maybe I normally would do. And there's certain things I have refined. That said, think the environment really works nicely. The muted lighting helps give it a different feel. The whole designs are great for the most part, and it pairs up, and you get some really good long views over the two courses. There's also a par 3 and a composite version, so if you're looking for things that you've yet to play in 2K23, do search those up and have a go around all four of these courses. Before diving into the second, I wanted to show you where it is on the routing, as this is really what makes it for me. Sandbelt courses find this way of putting in little par threes just to create a little bit more space where they may not have. And this was one that I felt did that quite nice. As for the hole itself, I really like the planting and the bunkering around the green. It's pretty typical of a sandbelt par 3 in that there was quite a generous green, but some big bunkers around it, and the green itself had broad, bold slopes. It's just one that I really enjoyed making and playing thereafter. The fourth was my favourite par 5 on the course, and really a triumph of editing more than anything else. There were bunkers protecting the landing zone on the right hand side, which kind of led you to feel to run further towards the left, but it was the approach that I really liked. This green moved about 4 times in construction and kept getting further back, and ultimately created this interesting bunker staggering effect and a green that was sitting back where you could run it on in a sort of bowl but sort of not. And ultimately, that created a ton of interesting approaches where you could bounce the ball short and run it on. And I really like the way this one sat in. On this course, I felt the front nine probably had the stronger individual holes, and I always really liked the ninth. Inspired heavily by Kingston Heath's ninth hole, you've got a bunker complex cutting in from the left, and then a green that's angled away from that. You also get the clubhouse coming into view, a lot of layered bunkers. So this one just set up really nicely. The green itself, pretty tough to hold, and you can see how we have to slope it certain ways in order to defend certain angles. But this one really more for aesthetic reasons than anything else.